I'm in perfect capacity there. There might be a couple more seats for latecomers. There's seats at the back. So thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Juliet Mian. I'm a director here in Arup in our climate sustainability portfolio. I lead adaptation and resilience services here in this region, and also lead our global skills network for resilience, which is a community of amazing people working all across the world on this topic. So this is, some of you may have been to the first in the series. We've got a series of events through the year on the topic of advancing climate resilience. When we started planning it at the beginning of the year, we did realise we're not going to cover this in one session. There's so many different aspects to resilience, so much to talk about. So in the first event a few months back, we were talking about assessing risk, understanding resilience, and how to sort of move that into planning and action. And today we want to get onto the topic of the actual measures, the practical measures that can be done to advance resilience and what's required to implement them, put them in. Mentioned at the end, we've got 2 more events till the end of the year, and then by the end of the year we'll have solved resilience and we can all move on and do something else. So we've got people, panellists here from different scales. I think that's going to be really valuable, sort of looking at everything from individual assets all the way up to city scales and bringing some of those different perspectives. Before I moved into the panel session itself, I just wanted to have a quick reflection. It's London Climate Action Week. Did anyone notice that? There's been a lot of conversations, there's been a lot of panel sessions. I hope some of you have been to other events here in Arup and all across London, just to reflect on this topic of talking about our subject all the time, because we do it a lot. I often go home at the end of the day and think, is that all that I did all day? I just talked about it. I do think it's absolutely critical that we do talk and that we do listen. I think resilience is not a competition that we just keep our good ideas to ourselves and get on with them and think that we're going to be fine. You actually have to share these ideas. We have to put them out there. I think we have to listen. Above all, it's about hearing what's working for other people and then putting that into practice. If that works, come back, celebrate it, share it, and you can sort of grow the movement. If it doesn't work, then still that's a conversation we need to have. So I think we've got members of the audience, we've got people joining us online. This is the conversation we want to be having. If there's aspects that you're not hearing through this, then let us know. We can try and bring those into future events. If there's things that are really working, then please share, because no one's resilient on their own. Everybody needs the sort of wider community and system to be resilient. We've got a Menti code here, so for people who are joining us online, please join into that. That will be your way to ask questions that we can put to the panellists through the event. Anyone in the room, please use your voices, but if you prefer not to use your voices, you can put a question into Menti, but I'd much rather not hear so much of my own voice. We wanted to start with a quick poll, which again, if you're in the room and you want to log on to join, do. If not, have a think. It might be something you'd want to share at the end. We wanted to just reflect on the next 3 to 6 months, the short-term period. Often when we're talking about climate resilience, we hear the 2050, the 2070, the 2100, where we're going to. But we wanted to hear what's going on for you right now. What are the short-term issues? Because I think that's one of the routes into implementation and action. So we put a few things that we think you might be thinking about. Extreme weather, what might be coming here in London and in other parts of the world through the summer. But also any other things that are your short-term priorities. We'd be really interested to see what that looks like. So I'm going to introduce the speakers briefly, then I'm going to sit down and hopefully a little bit less of my voice. So delighted to have, we've got Liza Rossi from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which from now on I'm just going to either call the bank or the EBRD, so it's not so much of a mouthful. Liza's a chartered architect and engineer by background, but in the EBRD she works on sustainability-related assessments and the delivery. Some of you may be familiar with this, but Liza will talk more about the Green City programme and the Green City action plans. Prior to joining the EBRD, she worked at the EC and at UN Habitat and has practiced architecture in a number of countries. We have another architect here, so that's always good because architects are very good communicators. So Tessa is an architect by training. Tessa is one of my very amazing colleagues here at Arup. Focused on sustainable design and interdisciplinary practice. Tessa has worked a lot here in the UK, in London and beyond, but also in Africa. So I'm hoping you're going to bring some of that global perspective, Tessa. And finally, we have, sorry, Carl, not a good way to. We have Carl Desai. So Carl's a sustainability manager from Lend-Lease, working on large, complex urban regeneration projects here in the UK. So projects that I'm sure a number of you will be familiar with, such as Silvertown in East London and Smithfield in Birmingham. And Carl's role as a sustainability manager focuses on both achieving net zero carbon and enhancing and delivering climate resilience in line with TCFD. So I think there'll be some interesting angles there. So I'm going to move here so that we're all very neatly sitting under our own photos in case anyone was going to get confused as to who was talking, and move into the conversation. So I'm going to just start the conversation with a few questions directly to the panellists, but as soon as we can, we will move on to questions from the room and questions coming online so that we can make it very conversational. When we had our first event, we didn't stick to the topic very well. I'm very happy to do that because that's when the conversation starts to get interesting. But as I said in the scene setting, what we want to hear about today is the practical examples. What can organisations do? What can we do as designers, as developers to enhance climate resilience? And maybe a little bit also on what's stopping us and what are some of the barriers. So I maybe start with Tessa. And you can choose, Tessa, whether you bring something that you're working on in the UK or something that you've seen in Africa. I'd love to hear more thoughts about what we can learn from countries that are more on the front line of climate hazards and climate change already, and probably vice versa, that kind of knowledge share. So.
Sure, thanks, Juliet. So I moved to the UK about 2 years ago, and my context is very much South African and sub-Saharan African, and I was very struck by the differences between an understanding of what resilience means at a building and a building at scale perspective between the UK and London and Cape Town in South Africa. And my reflection on that in thinking about it is very much around the strength and the agency of the different actors. So in a South African context, typically we have quite weak's not the right word, but the institutions and the public entities don't have actually enough money to be doing enough stuff. So you can't rely on the fact that you turn on the tap and the water's going to flow out. You can't rely on the fact that you're going to have 24/7 uninterrupted electrical supply. And that means that the decisions made by the building developers and building occupiers are very different because they need to be standing on their own 2 feet. They need to have a level of resilience so that the buildings can be occupied 24/7 safely and comfortably. So that is a stark difference. I think here in the UK, the public construct is much stronger. The reliability of public services and utilities is taken actually for granted, I think. People, like if you imagine that you won't have water flowing out of your tap for half an hour, I mean, that could stop London, just about. And so I think that here, if we find that the building developers and building occupiers don't build that level of resilience into their designs. And I think that in time, that will have an impact on the people that are occupying the buildings when we see these extreme climate events impacting us. So flooding and the impacts that would have, as well as the impact on energy supply.
Thanks, Tess. I think it's a really good point about being used to outages and where we are in this country now, where it's not familiar. You know, anyone who's got teenagers, the power cut would be beyond their imagination almost. And I was at an event last week at the Institute of Civil Engineers where we had 3 colleagues from the ICE South Africa, and I was somewhat embarrassed to be talking about power cuts and about power outages and about water shortages because we don't really have them here. And I think there's that, maybe interesting to hear, Carl, from you on this, but trying to influence decisions against something that's not happening at the moment, we will be much better if we prepare for that rather than reacting to it. But it's a difficult issue and it's something that doesn't feel very tangible. So what do you see from Lend-Lease?
Yeah, I think those future challenges really are hard to kind of contextualize and make tangible for design teams today. So at Lend-Lease, we're very much looking ahead to the future. So we've set 2 kind of key targets. Well, one key target around absolute zero carbon by 2040. So that's making sure that we reduce all the embodied carbon from our new developments by 2040. But we're not naive in thinking that climate change isn't already here, and that even if we reduce our emissions, we're still on track to a kind of a 3 or 4 degree warming scenario by the end of the century. So it is challenging to get a design team in a room and to start thinking about how that building is going to operate in 20, 40, 60 years' time, which is the lifespan of our developments. And it's especially hard when you're trying to make the value case to a new investor or to your client as to what's the value of actually building in resilience to your building. It's perceived as a potentially additional cost. Are we going to really be impacted by climate change? It still feels like a kind of a distant concept. It's quite abstract. So I guess what we've done in the last few years is we've undertaken that TCFD reporting, as you mentioned, at a corporate level. But again, that's quite intangible. So how does that actually translate down to our developments? We undertook some work, shout out to Stephen who's in the audience, with Arup and Useful Projects to actually translate what does resilience mean to our development projects today. And I can run through exactly how that applies to our developments. Shall I do that now?
Do that now. Perfect. Thank you.
It's essentially looking at what the regulatory requirements are, but then extending that out to future scenarios. So we accept that there's going to be a level of kind of flooding, but how do we add it on a climate change impact on top of that? We accept there's kind of current overheating modelling that we undertake as part of kind of GLA requirements, but how do we actually model against a 2050 or 2080 scenario to understand how our buildings are going to respond in those conditions, looking at wind modelling and kind of drought conditions as well. So if there's, how do we reduce our reliance on fresh water? So we've got that framework, and now the challenge is actually driving it through into our developments and making sure the design teams are responding to what gets produced from those kind of modelling exercises.
Sounds good. And if anyone in the audience online has similar examples, because I think this is one of the challenges. So Len, you're working in this space ahead of codes and ahead of regulation and finding your way through. And I think this is something we could certainly share. So Liza, I think you're bringing a different perspective, working for the bank and at that sort of investment point of view. So could you tell us a bit about what you're seeing?
Absolutely. So I think from an EBRD perspective, how we see resilience is very much rooted in the commitment of the bank to align with the Paris alignment, with the Paris Agreement. So we both need to ensure that our investments are consistent with a low carbon pathway, but also climate resilient. And so we undertake both these assessments when we carry out project appraisals for projects that the bank is considering financing. And this can take multiple forms. Obviously, the first key step is to ensure that we assess and identify all the physical risks that are affecting the selected site or sites, because projects might be more widespread. And once those risks are identified, then we would ensure that the project integrates the necessary measures to reduce to an acceptable level physical risks. And this takes multiple shapes and forms. It goes from design measures integrated in the actual project to operational measures, emergency procedures that we would require our clients to adopt. So this is very much something that we integrate in the covenants that we put in our loan agreements, which is how we ensure that the assets are resilient to climate change. And obviously we would try and we always try and support our clients in achieving the acceptable reduction of risk. And building on what Carl was saying, it's a very similar approach in ensuring that we first identify the risk, current risk, but we also project it to future scenarios. So considering both optimistic and pessimistic ones.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to maybe push a bit more to try and get some real examples. So if each of you could talk about a particular location, a particular project, what you're seeing or what you're not seeing. You know, I think there's something very important about this. We understand the risks, we understand what needs to be done, but you know, a real barrier that's stopping that coming in, just so that everyone in the audience can start to sort of think, okay, so that's a type of project that the EBRD might be funding in a city because they've got the confidence to invest in it. So I might start that one with you, Liza. You know, one of the cities or regions that you're working in, and what a real project would be.
So I think a nice example, and it's touching on a geography that's a bit different, not too far from us. Chisinau, capital city of Moldova. The EBRD supported the city in developing the Green City Action Plan a few years ago, and through a very thorough and extensive, of course, baseline exercise, it was confirmed that, obviously the city was already aware of that, but it was evidence-based assessment that flooding was a major issue, and including fluvial and fluvial flooding. So this was then formalized, this challenge was formalized and recognized as a priority by the city in the Green City Action Plan. And actions towards flood risk mitigations were included in the GCAP. Based on that, the city then decided to invest in those actions and in flood risk mitigation, and the EBRD, together with other financiers and the GCF, provided funding for a project that we call the River Brick project, so the rehabilitation. Yes. Can you hear me? So the River Brick project, about the rehabilitation of the river, the crossing the city from north to south, including hard engineering, so the usual flood wall that you would see along the riverbanks, but also with the integration of nature-based solution, with the increase of permeable areas around the city and along the riverbanks. And the project has recently started its implementation, so we're very excited to see it completed, with obvious benefits from a climate resilience perspective, but also environmentally speaking on water pollution, etc.
Okay, that might be something to come back to, those wider benefits.
Exactly, so we wouldn't be looking at just one aspect, one type of benefits, but try and see what are the wider co-benefits of each investment.
So in this case, water pollution.
Water pollution, yes. Yes, was also a major challenge.
Thank you. So Carl, maybe to look at, we mentioned a couple, but there might be other projects that you're working on. From the guidance that you have, from your sort of policy level, what do you want to see? What are some of the measures that you would want to see for climate resilience? I guess who's benefiting? You know, what's in it for Lend-Lease? What's in it for your occupiers and your sort of communities? And if there are barriers to that, so Liza's just sort of talked about the from the planning all the way to implementation starting, but there's so many things along that route that we need to overcome. So if there are any barriers that you're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, I guess overheating is a significant concern for our new developments. I think the statistic is that half of the UK's residential properties are at risk of overheating currently. That's just our existing residential properties. So we are a mixed-use developer, but we also build quite a lot of mid-rise apartment buildings. And I guess this journey that we've been on to actually understand resilience and future impacts on our developments today is entirely voluntary. So regulation really isn't requiring us to do this additional modelling and to build in this resilience. And effectively, there's a potentially lack of guidance in the industry around how do you kind of codify this, how do you quantify the impacts. and what are the key criteria you need to hit, which is why we had to undertake that kind of bespoke project with Arup and Useful Projects to develop our resilience framework. So I guess one of the key challenges is potentially regulation needs to catch up. We've seen the GLA require kind of TM52, TM59 modelling, but I think that's based on current weather scenarios, it's not based on future scenarios. So I think that's maybe a lever that needs to be pulled relatively soon as well, because yeah, we're a progressive developer, we're doing this voluntarily, but it would be good for regulation to kind of guide us on that path and be quite supportive. I guess one of the challenges that we face is that all well and good for the sustainability professional to kind of champion this, but really we need development teams and senior stakeholders to buy into it. And currently that value add on resilience is currently kind of missing. So it'll be interesting to hear more from the bank's perspective around how do you actually give a building a badge to say, yes, this building is going to be resilient in these future in some future scenario, because I think that's currently unclear. Like there's a BREEAM credit on resilience, but it's kind of obfuscated in everything else that's going on. So how do we kind of increase the understanding and awareness of how important resilience actually is?
Great. Tessa, you're ready to come in. Perfect.
It's such an interesting point, and it asks the question, where is the value in resilience? Because I think when, like now, we're living in a time that's relatively stable. I mean, we're seeing extreme weather events more and more, and the shocks and stresses and how we are able to respond to them are quite different with how they responded to at a building scale versus at a city scale. And I think it's an interesting thing with working ahead of the codes, because there's a business case in that. It means that when these extreme weather events do happen, your assets, the Lend-Lease's assets, will have more value intrinsically. But then at the same time, if those extreme weather events don't happen, then you're spending money on something that you're not getting back. So it's a really interesting question. I've got an example of a developer that we work a lot with in South Africa, who in our unique context, where there is not enough water and there's not enough power and there's social unrest and all these things, that developer has spent a lot of money on resilience. And as a result, the square meter rates that they can get for their assets are significantly higher than anyone else in the surrounding area. So there's an immediate business case there, but it is a different context with different drivers and different value. And I wonder how things would change in this context. And in a sense, we hope it doesn't, right? Because we don't want those extreme weather events to happen. But equally, the 4-degree future, which is what you've just referenced, that's kind of horrifying. And we do need to start thinking about that.
We do, and I think questions will come in a minute. Great to see that they're ready to come. Oh, thank goodness. In case people had forgotten who we were, the background. Oh no, you'll have to keep it in your heads. But I think one of the challenges we find in terms of investing in resilience is it's almost harder to see resilience than to see the absence of it. And coming back to my point in the beginning about we're all in this, so it's that example, Tessa, from South Africa is fantastic, but actually that developer's premium property is only so good if the rest of the community is not resilient. You know, if others around them haven't done that, and so the infrastructure, the homes, the other offices, the shops aren't there, then you only get to a certain point with your resilience. So it's about this collective need. And I think maybe, and Liza had mentioned the other benefits of resilience. If we're literally only looking at an investment from the perspective of we spend this much money for extreme scenarios in 2050, you know, it does become very hard. But if we spend this much money and we can deliver social amenity, we can deliver nature-based solutions, we can deliver, you know, cooling for the summer that we're going to have now, then it starts to become a bit more. In principle, the business case starts to be there. That doesn't still mean that it's the thing that, you know, the money that will be spent. So Carl, have you got any specific examples of cost and decisions that have to be made about, well, we could do this to enhance resilience? What type of a cost premium and how does that decision play through?
Yeah, I think it's quite challenging to put a round figure on it.
Yeah.
So as we go through kind of the design process, we will have a series of options that our engineers will produce, let's say for take overheating, for example, around, okay, you've done your TM59 modeling, you're exposed to overheating in this many apartments. Here are the 4 options you can consider. You can put in ceiling fans, you can add some external shading, you can improve your ventilation, or you can add some kind of active cooling kind of mechanical system. So then it's up to the development managers really to assess which is the option they want to take forward. And ideally there would be some co-benefits. So if you can kind of improve the ventilation rates, for example, use more passive means, it's going to reduce energy costs, which is a benefit to the occupier. But I'd say it's quite challenging to put a round figure on exactly what that might be. I think the challenge that I was maybe hinting at earlier is that a lot of this stuff is also very qualitative. So you can say our residents in 20 years' time won't be sweltering on a 30-degree day, but that's really hard to really to sell to a potential buyer. So I think that's maybe the challenge also.
Putting some hard numbers against it. One of my reflections listening to you all is I think both Tessa and Carl are, you're talking in the context of developments that are happening anyway that need to be more resilient. And your example, Liza, for Moldova was specifically to the bank selecting the projects that will enhance resilience because they're needed. Do you see anything in your investments where actually the investment is driven by reconstruction development and you're trying to can you bring resilience into all the projects? Have you got an example from that perspective?
We try our best to do that. We try our best to do that in every investment that we have. So we have a high-level differentiation between projects that we consider that are adapted to climate change. So it's not resilience might not your primary goal, but you should ensure that the activity can still take place in under a climate change scenario. So putting in all of the adaptation measures that would be required. For instance, linking to the overheating example that Carl was making, ensuring that hospital building can still run and provide the essential services even during a heat wave, and ensuring that the users that are patients and vulnerable to extreme heat can still use the facilities. So, and this again can take the form of passive solutions, external shading, but mechanical as well, etc. And then we have the other stream of, and those would be the adapted activities. Then we have the other stream of activities that are the ones that enable resilience. That would be the cases of the River Big project that I was mentioning earlier, for instance. But absolutely, so again, going back to the bank's commitment to alignment with the Paris Agreement, mitigation of physical climate risks need to be integrated in all of our projects. And from an organizational perspective, the commitment is also for our own operation, but of course the main focus is on the projects that you deliver.
So I think there is something interesting there around who's making the investment decisions and what their drivers, principles, policies are. So I know there was a question from the audience, I think it was when we were talking about codes. So because your hand went up already, please. We've got mics, so if people, I'll try and take a few from the audience, a few online and come back, but there, so middle, can you just put your hand up again to get the mic, sorry.
Probably won't need it.
Well, you will need it, sorry, just because of the people that are online, they won't hear you otherwise. Thanks.
Hello. Can I be greedy and have 2 questions? The first one I think is a short one.
Yeah.
There seems to be some uncertainty over the future, and that's a given. But my first question is, as designers and a contractor in this instance, as opposed to a developer, didn't we currently have an obligation to deliver buildings that are capable of lasting between 50 and 100 years? And on what basis what's the current basis that you're using for your design in order to achieve that? And if not, what have we been doing all this time? Question mark. And then the second one was, who should really be responsible for defining the climate resilient brief? Should it be a government-led thing in terms of legislation, regulation, or is it we as occupants of buildings, and we're only here for a limited period of time, and so our context will change over that time? Is it lenders, investors, developers, consultants, or the contractor with entire design responsibility?
Both excellent questions. Tessa, the first one, what are we doing at the moment for our designs for buildings that are going to be here, buildings or infrastructure that will be here for 50 or 100 years?
That's a fantastic question, and I like the question mark, because I don't think that we have the right answer. And my opinion on it is that in the last number of years, decades, we have been driven more by cost rather than outcome. And if we look back, for instance, just around London, we live in a really old city. Like, there's a lot of old stuff, and that old stuff is still functional. It still works, except for this overheating conversation, because actually the nature of the building fabric doesn't work with the climate, or it's starting not to work with the climate anymore in terms of orientation. You know, there's a really interesting conversation around that. But otherwise, the building fabric works, and some of it's 1,000 years old, you know. So I think with more modern buildings and more modern time, the cost conversation has been much more dominant than the value of the asset and its longevity. So, yeah, what are we doing? I agree. Question mark.
Great,
I mean, I
answered
don't...
the question with a question.
Yeah, I don't really have an answer to that, because I agree with you. And I think what we need to be doing as designers in terms of influencing our clients is having robust and principled conversations with them about where costs could and couldn't be cut. Because there are many instances where we would recommend something and the client disagrees. So I've got an example. There's a project, a big distribution center in Durban somewhere in South Africa, and we recommended code compliant stormwater drainage around the facility. And we were absolutely, trying to think of the word, pushed down by the rest of by the quantity surveyor, essentially, influencing the client. And they said, absolutely not. This is not normal. Too much money. No way, no way, no way. Arup are being way too conservative. You guys need to have a reality check. We pushed and we pushed and we pushed, using all the levers that we could. Finally, these flood, essentially stormwater drains, suitably sized, were installed. 10 years later, in Durban 2 years ago, there were catastrophic floods, like 1 in 100-year storms that happened within 2, 3 weeks of each other. That building was the only one that wasn't flooded and washed away in an entire business park. So it was it's not funny, but it was slightly amusing to see a WhatsApp message from the building owner standing in front of his building, videoing the surrounding area with water flowing everywhere, and around his building it was flowing through the stormwater, the appropriately sized stormwater channels. And he was just like, wow, this is it, right? And so, well, I had nothing to do with that one, but we can applaud our colleagues. But I think it's a really good example of how we do need to be quite robust when it comes to the advice that we give as professionals to our clients. And I think now having examples, which is I know a lot of what the conversation is today, having examples to draw upon can start to support the conversations perhaps, and give practical examples to decision makers who wouldn't have them otherwise.
And I think there is that switch from, I mean, your example, Tessa, that was just about complying with code, but we also have the fact that our code parameters are normally based on historical weather data, and moving us into that conversation of that doesn't reflect what's happening in the future, but the future might be 2 degrees, it might be 4 degrees, there's a lot of uncertainty in the modelling, here's the decision you now have to make. You know, it is a difficult space. So we talked so much about that. So the second question I was going to put to Carl, where should the action sit? Whose responsibility is it to switch us from how we are approaching our designs and developments at the moment to something that will be fit for the future?
Good question.
From a contractor, you're going to have one particular
Yeah.
point of view.
It's a good question. I think just reflecting on what was being said earlier, I think, I was going to say, the point around this being non-negotiable, I think, is really important because often sustainability features are seen as a bit of an add-on. So you can go for BREEAM if you want. It's a bit fluffy, it's a bit vague, but actually resilience is, it's kind of like it's an engineering requirement. It shouldn't be a sustainability requirement. So I think almost giving it that level of importance, the fact that it should be in the brief from kind of stage 0 is really is required. It shouldn't be something that a sustainability manager kind of has to try and loop into the design at stage 2. I think so. Yeah, I think that's probably key. Is that the client needs to require this from the briefing stage. Again, yeah, policy needs to catch up. So just reflecting on the weather files that we're using as well, I think the CIBSE TM59 uses like 2014 weather files, but we're now in 2024 and weather patterns are changing quite drastically. So kind of making sure that we are reflecting current day scenarios, but then also looking forward to future scenarios is critical. So I'd say, yeah, regulation there. And I think a plea to all the standard bodies would be try and make this stuff a bit more intelligible for non-technical people, because I've kind of had to read through energy statements to find the section on overheating, and it's talking about DSY 1, 2, 3 and all these different TM references. I think if we can make this in language that everyone can understand in the design team, but also decision makers, that's just going to make this more prevalent and kind of in people's psyche. Otherwise, it's just the domain of the mechanical engineer, which just gets kind of hidden away.
Really good shout. I thought Antonietta's hand might be going up, but there was someone who had. Okay, so 2 or 3 more. So yeah. Okay, so go ahead. But hang on, Anto, you'll need the mic just because of the people who are joining online. Sorry. So we'll follow up on those weather files. A couple more questions in the room, and then we'll pick up some that are coming online.
My question was around the approach to preparing our buildings to future climate and extreme weather scenarios. In my view, there are almost like 2 alternative approaches. One is designing for the present with a backup plan for the future, and another one is trying to make our building resilient to variable conditions. And the way I see that happening is by passive approaches, which are not simply like adding external shadings or opening the window. We need more radical change in the way we design building, and particularly around residential buildings. A study we did a few years ago shows that the layout of the flats is the main thing. Having cross ventilation is the main thing to reduce the overheating. But I don't see that in residential blocks that are being designed now. And to what Tessa was saying earlier, we see the newer building to be more prone to overheating than the ones built a century ago. So how ready are the developers and the market in general to change the way we design building very drastically, rather than coming up with mechanical solutions that can only make the problem worse? We know that adding cooling will increase urban entitlement effect and therefore worsen the climate change scenario. So what do we need to make that drastic change, and why is it not happening at the moment?
Simple question, if anyone wants to just... Tessa?
Well, I would like to hear your perspective on it as well. But from my perspective, my approach to this is what I really think of as resilient comfort, which is thinking like, how can we remain comfortable in a room of a building when there's no electricity to turn on, press a button on the wall and get cool air magically flowing into your room, or rely on heating to heat the space during winter? What mechanisms and what design steps can we put in place to create those spaces? And I think we're quite fortunate in the UK. Like, it is a cold environment, yes, but there are ways to work with that we don't have to be so reliant on energy, essentially, to warm and cool the spaces. And coming from a warmer, more Mediterranean climate, we're very lucky we can rely on entirely passive design. I think in the UK it's a little bit different. It is a bit colder. But equally, with a 4-degree future, there are lots of models where you start thinking that there is a more Mediterranean climate going to happen in the UK, or if the jet stream stops going and then it's going to get colder like Norway. So it's a little bit uncertain. But I think going back to first principles design and saying, how can we create a comfortable space that will account for 98% of the year, which actually is fine, and then working out from that. And I think a lot of it has to do with orientation and ventilation.
Yeah.
Principles. It's just basics.
We were touching on that just before the session.
Yeah.
Saying that most of the big gains in terms of resilience go back to design principles, orientation.
Yeah. So not the add-on, the thing, and I think Carl's challenge of, as a sustainability manager, trying to influence those decisions when the big decisions have been made. I think that's one of the changes. We have the next session, we're hoping to talk more about leadership and behaviour change, and I think that, where these big decisions are made and by whom and how do people bring some of that in. So there's a lot there. Imogen, just to make sure we're being inclusive of our audience online as well, I'm going to maybe a couple of questions that are coming through.
Could I quickly
Of course you
respond
can,
to that question?
Carl, sorry.
It's interesting. The three of us have all studied architecture, and
Three of you,
it's funny
sorry.
mention first principles, because this is like it's first day of architecture school. How do you design with the local environment front of mind, so you reduce reliance on mechanical systems?
Yeah.
But that's just been kind of undone in our current way of design thinking, and I think it's probably a condition of kind of market factors. So we typically design in urban regeneration sites, so we're constrained about how we can orient buildings and how much space we have for kind of open green space, permeable space, etc. And I guess it's all about development value. So that's what we're driven by. So how can we maximize floor area and the number of apartments we can almost squeeze into a block? So that almost dictates your layout more so than dual aspect ventilation or whatever it might be. But I think you raise a good point around how do we design for today, but also how can we just have that that built-in resilience for future scenarios. So you don't have to install that cooling equipment today.
But
it might be in 20, 40 years' time that you have space allowance for that. And also the behavioural things around how do you teach occupiers to actually operate their building in the most kind of energy efficient way.
Really good point. Thanks, Carl. And sorry for not introducing you as an architect as well. I had no idea. I was surrounded by architects.
Thanks, Juliet. So this question's online. I'm just going to go to the second one, which is about taking risk-based approach, looking at shocks and stresses and mitigation measures increases the resistance capacity of the system. Resilience moves beyond that to include the ability to recover quickly and adapt by learning from the event. How are these dimensions of resilience included?
Thanks, Imogen. I think that's a really good question. So one of the things that we've reflected so far is, in fact, in many of the designs in the UK, we are struggling to even get to step one, which is how might these parameters change. But exactly as the question says, that's not enough. Any parameters for the future we use could be higher, could be lower. There's a huge element of uncertainty. There will always be the potential for exceedance, whether that's flood or storms or extreme heat, and how do we respond, adapt, recover, actually be resilient to the unexpected as well as the things we're already thinking about. I think that would be a great perspective from you because of the bank's sort of view on resilience.
Absolutely, and I mean there's only so much redundancy that you can account for due to the inherent uncertainty that climate change brings. So in terms of ensuring that there is a quick reaction and bouncing back after the shock. I think this is when we account for reduced damages to the infrastructure that we finance. And it's not only on the specific asset that is being financed, but we also look at the wider context about how this infrastructure could enable a quicker bouncing back after an event. So it's something that is integrated within our project appraisals.
And I think perhaps we've touched on it a bit in the conversation, but maybe in further answers to think about this, it isn't only the physical measures, the physical design, even if it's the kind of upsizing of plant rooms for the future. There are, I mean, you'd mentioned behaviours of occupants, there are policy, there are operational measures, there are monitoring and responding. So all of that is part of the package, and how much of that can any one organisation influence? Imogen, is there another question?
There's another question online, which is what public domain or commercial tools are you using to assess and monetize risks? Do we need practical guidance with costed measures with paybacks, example, for external shading, nature-based solutions, etc.?
That's a great question. We'll see if anyone's got immediate things to say. It might go to the audience as well. It feels like that could be a great question to follow up on somehow in terms of the tools that we have, the tools that we need. Are we all using different tools? Where are we getting to with that? But if any of you have got examples of a kind of commercialized, productized approach,
I'm afraid I don't.
No.
For building scale resilience, I think it's a really good question, and one that should be thought about at a building scale. I expect that building owners, as the risks become more prevalent, so as, for instance, water scarcity becomes more prevalent, and hopefully it doesn't, but as it does, the cost, for instance, of installing or reducing demand, harvesting what you can, and having some water storage facility in order to have your own source, the cost of that tank and all of the pumps and all that starts to become a real cost. And there is an immediate cost-benefit analysis to be done with that. But I think that's done very building scale. And I don't know of any tools just the normal design tools that we would use in terms of sizing for those things. I can't think of any other larger scale tools.
No, me neither, apart from, ensuring that your CBA takes those benefits into account adequately.
So I don't want to make this into a promoting Arup tools kind of conversation, so it might be something that we follow up on, but there is something about the risk assessment. So a sort of TCFD level risk assessment doesn't help you understand that building level, what's the risk. We do have tools and approaches in Arup. We have a tool we use called IRIS, which helps you to quantify the risk to an individual asset of a code-compliant design compared to a resilience-based design. It's not always used, but I think it's something to maybe dig into a bit more, and we'd be happy to follow up. So I'm going to take a couple of questions. The gentleman on the second from the back row, you had your hand up. Yeah, you, with the white shirt, you had your hand up a while ago, so thanks.
Thank you. My question was a little bit more about sort of stranded assets and the business case for resilience. Given the designing assets for a fairly long lifespan, and obviously the valuation of the asset is not just dependent upon its function now, but its function in the future, both when it comes to future insurability of the asset and future resale value of the asset. What do you think the finance community, so for example the EBRD, but also people in valuations, other investors, and even frameworks that can be used to reflect the value of adaptation and climate resilience in asset values at the moment as opposed to in the future?
Thank you. Liza?
I can't really talk to the asset value point, but in terms of avoiding that the asset is stranded in a few years' time, that's where I would go back to ensuring that your risk assessment is there, is solid, takes into account future projections, to the extent possible, of course. And this goes back also to a point that, Carl, you were making on the value that we give to resilience. We do run a valorization of the resilience benefits that we would expect from a specific adaptation measure in a project. So, and this is how we assign a value to ensuring that to those measures, and how this compares to then all the costs that are associated with it. In terms of insurability, we don't do insurance, but I think asset managers would have similar approaches in terms of the very basic thing you have to ensure is that you have an operational plan to respond to emergency events, and then you can build on top of that with design measures.
So that real tangible valuing of resilience, I think, is great. Tessa, you're ready, but I also just wanted to quickly ask Carl about insurance and whether you've got anything to see. Is that a driver for change, what insurers want to see?
Yeah, most definitely. I think, again, as the risks become more prevalent and front of mind in people's psyche, it's going to become easier to value and intuitively understand the insurance risk. So we are also an investor, so we buy buildings, we look at potential buildings, and we'll do that climate risk assessment. So we use Swiss Re tool, but really you just get a bit of a heat map which says, okay, there's going to be a risk at this date. And again, that's on a long list of different parameters you're looking at for a building. So I just don't think it has the importance that maybe it does deserve, or maybe over time that'll improve. But again, this piece around, okay, how do you actually give a building a specific achievement or badge to say, yes, this is going to be fine, and under this scenario that's currently not there. So we'd have to do all that modelling ourselves as well. So it's still a bit unclear on that link between how it's designed and the risk in terms of resilience.
I was going to say a similar thing, and I agree completely. I think the connection between the risk event and then how that risk event could be mitigated is not currently there. So, for instance, we have a project here in London where the water pressure was sufficient to not require a fire water storage tank. So it was BE'd out against our advice. So now, 4, 5, 6 years later, that decision is being turned on its head because the water pressure has reduced. Now there is a fire water tank that's required. Without that, the building is not insurable. It's not code compliant, can't be occupied. So that's quite a good example of how like these very cost-based decisions result in fundamental, like you can't occupy the building. So there's no space for a fire water tank, but space has to be made because otherwise the entire asset that's been developed for 12 years can't be used. So I think that that connection is really crucial. And I think all of us as designers and decision makers and developers need to be really actively making that connection. And, you know, the risk assessments is a really important point up front in the building process. It's really critical.
And something there around those very early stage, coming back to when the what if decision, you know, what if the water pressure changes, should have been should have been part of the discussion, and at least to have the capacity for it. And I think sometimes our boundaries are too small to sort of move beyond and make the right decisions. There have been so many hands to get through in 6 minutes. So yeah, the gentleman in the blue shirt, thank you. I will do my best. We can carry on the conversation afterwards with coffees and pastries, because I don't think we'll get to everyone.
So my question is basically, how can independent building rating systems like BREEAM help to drive resilience, given that there's a balancing act between being futuristic, ambitious, and also practical and acceptable? So if your BREEAM standard is too high, nobody's going to sign up for the rating system at all. So can you reflect on that?
Great question. I think that probably Carl, Tessa, I guess BREEAM doesn't really come into the EBRD space, so maybe put that to Carl.
Yeah, I don't know what the solution is, but the closest that I can think of is, so net zero carbon buildings is a very new concept, and it's kind of it's diluted, but it's in BREEAM. But now we're kind of breaking that out, and there's specific KPIs around net zero carbon, and there's going to be a net zero carbon building standard. So that badge is very explicit, and I don't know if resilience needs to break out from BREEAM in a similar way, so that you've got a standalone, very clear and understandable set of KPIs that a building can achieve and that you can kind of hang your hat on. I don't know if that's a solution. The BREEAM credit currently, I think, is quite open. It's quite qualitative. but perhaps we need some hard kind of criteria that a building needs to meet in order to satisfy kind of market best practice.
I think it's just a quick reflection. Having said, I was trying to fit all the questions in. So, because we're having quite a buildings-focused conversation here, and there's definitely, well, I think there's something to learn about that journey from where we were to net zero buildings, which is not yet as visible in terms of resilience of buildings. Whereas with infrastructure, and perhaps looking at sort of flood infrastructure and some of the things I work on in the road and rail space, that resilience is very visible because of the impacts of the disruption. So there's all these sort of transferable lessons or what the journey looks like that we need to work on. I'm hoping someone with the mic is sort of seeing where the hands have been waiting the longest.
Thank you. So there's been a lot of talk clearly about new buildings. I think someone earlier mentioned how about 50% of our residential buildings in the country are not adapted to cope with heat waves, and that's where my research interest lies really. For my master's dissertation, sort of from a social justice perspective, I looked at social housing in Cambridgeshire, so that's some of the most vulnerable people with the least agency to make their own adaptations to their homes. And I looked at council housing and also housing association social homes, and interviewed people working in those fields to see what was being done around adaptation to overheating, if anything. And what I found is that whilst there are retrofitting programs going on, this is mainly to cope with insulation, to cope with winter temperatures, but there hasn't been a joined-up approach at all. And mainly, they're not taking overheating in the summers into consideration. So whilst they might be insulating, for example, if they're not ventilating, if they're not insulating in the right way, they're actually building in overheating in the future, which is actually could lead to more fuel poverty if people are going to have to then install energy, cooling means that are not passive, use energy and cost the money, which a lot of these people are on the breadline and cannot do. And so I wondered if the panellists could comment at all on existing infrastructure and residential and other buildings that need to be adapted using like a whole building approach rather than project by project, not taking into account the whole resilience of the building. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good question. I think I had questions here, just in the unlikely scenario that we didn't get any from the audience, but one of those was, is this just becoming a feature that you see on premium buildings? And that's not what we need. We need all buildings to be resilient. The retrofit for energy and carbon needs to be resilient. I don't know if any of you feel you're working in that space to comment on it, or if anyone in the audience wants to respond.
I think if I can just make a quick comment. I mean, it's a great question, and obviously an issue that's very key. And this maybe is one of the cases where, in addition to looking at the building itself, we look at the surrounding environment. So looking at ways of reducing air temperature and through shading, more trees. I know it sounds simplistic, but it actually, you know, enhancing the tree coverage is one of the main things you could look at outside of the
individual
single
buildings.
building.
Yeah. So I'm going to take a couple more, Imogen, if that's okay. I know we're approaching time, and we just wanted to sort of close with the results of the question, but anyone who waves the highest and hardest will get the last two. So, okay, this one and then one more at the back.
This is probably quite a good follow-on from the previous question. I was going to ask if you could comment a little on the potential but not inevitable conflict between building your own kind of resilient fort and adversity impacting the resilience either of your direct neighbours or of someone somewhere in the world because you've spent a lot of carbon to do that. Versus looking for some holistic system-wide solution, which is probably much harder to conceptualise and integrate in your design.
Awesome question. 30 seconds. Anyone got the answer for that? If it's a fort, it's not resilient, it's robust. That's the problem. And it's so However, lots of people are making their decisions around their own individual thoughts, so that's the change that we need to see. There you go. I answered it myself.
The only
Anyone?
thing that I'd add is I know London has a really good program around cool spaces.
Yeah.
So let's take that we can't retrofit all our buildings tomorrow. So how do we provide community infrastructure that provides those cool spaces for individuals to retreat to? I think that's a good program, but that's an interim step. So can you provide, more of those? The point around kind of the injustice of it all is also very relevant, because we know that in some of the more deprived communities, there's less green space, so there's more chance for the urban heat island effect. So yeah, they're all kind of very intertwined, but again, that community infrastructure piece is probably going to be a key stepping stone.
So good examples like the cool spaces. One more question, and Louise, maybe if you can just bring up the poll results while we're taking this question, so we can.
Thank you. I'd like to ask what our resilience can learn from the mindset shift that net zero did for mitigation. And it's a very timely question, because today is the 5th anniversary of the UK signing net zero into law. That might not be a good analogy, because I think, as we heard from Carl, it's a lot harder to quantify our resilience. And while net zero, led to laggard sectors like logistics and others suddenly realising they had to decarbonise rather than do things around the edge, perhaps it's not individual sectors that aren't looking at adaptation, but rather we need to think of things like cascading risks that cross sectors.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think the carbon agenda and the resilience agenda there's such a fantastic opportunity for them to be aligned, but I do think that there's a risk right now that they're not, because resilience costs carbon. So how are these decisions being made around what net zero means and what resilience could mean? And so I think understanding what resilience looks like, which is what you were saying earlier, like for each building, there needs to be this risk assessment to say, this is what resilience means for this asset, for this series of assets in this area, and then working backwards from that. And I think a very value-based and principle-based assessment of what that means, including the carbon aspects and the value of that is required. And currently we don't have
I think it's a great conversation. I think people will have more to add to that. I would very much like us to get to the place where these aren't the two separate agendas and are learning from one. It's climate resilient development, which is low carbon and resilient. So sorry that we didn't get to everyone's questions. Please follow up in the chat. We'll pick up some of the key issues. We'll think about how we can put those into our next two events, where we had broadly hoped to look at behavioural change and look at monitoring and evaluation and how we actually see the progress in what we're doing. But please feed back to us. It's always great to see quite so many questions and quite so many hands go up. It means we've sort of hit the right topic and there's plenty more to talk about. So I was just, as we were talking, I was seeing the top 3 risks keep moving around, which is interesting. So water scarcity, when the bar chart first came up, was at the top. That people may be influenced by what the discussion has been having. Securing insurance is not there. So I guess that's because it's not always the next 3 to 6 months. Still having that change. Is there a word cloud as well, Louise, for the other? Or okay, we'll share that afterwards. So we'd love to hear from people in the audience as well about what's driving your decisions at the moment. What's the biggest concern? Because this is not the future issue, is today's issue as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and it's been a great conversation. Thanks.